Thank you. So now I'd like to welcome three distinguished participants to a panel discussion on the renewed great power competition between the United States and China. First of all, is Professor Joseph Nye, who is a university distinguished professor and former dean of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Chair of National Intelligence Council, Deputy Under-Secretary of State, and he's ranked continuously as the most influential thinker on international relations. Please welcome Professor Nye. And Dr. Adam Segal is the Ira Lipman Chair in Emerging Technologies and National Security and the Director of the Digital and Cyberspace Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations, an expert on security issues, technology development, and Chinese security, domestic and foreign policy. Segal was the project director for the CFRS-sponsored independent task force defending an open, global, secure New Zealand internet. Then we have, of course, Dr. Chris Demchak. Please join us on stage. And Dr. Paul Cornish. No? Not on this one. On the next one. My mistake. Okay. So, I suppose joining the stage. Well, there are several issues that we can discuss. I suppose I will just use my position as a moderator to ask a couple of questions, and then we'll open up a little bit for the audience. First question is, again, from our own perspectives, given these developments in the competition between US and China, it surely is a very important issue, but from the perspectives of the states who are allies of the United States, what can we and should we be doing in this context of this another round of developments driven by technology and security affairs? Very broad question, but let's say just thinking of it from a perspective of states which are not the United States or China.
Sure. So the word in Chris and Yuval's presentation of reciprocity is the one that I think has been coming up a lot. If you think about what China is trying to achieve on the technology frontier, which is only normal for a country and economy of that size, China has long wanted to reduce dependence on foreign technologies. I think the issue has been how the tools that they've adopted to do that, and we know that there is a large reliance on industrial policy that involves forced technology transfers through joint ventures, through the cybersecurity law, which is going to require data localization and equipment reviews. And so I think if you were going to build a broad response of the US and its allies, because there is concern in Europe and Japan and other places about these practices, then you would pressure on those fronts and in many ways ask for the things that Chris kind of asked for. If you're going to require US companies to technology transfer, then we're going to ask the same thing of you, or if you're going to reduce investment in certain sectors, we're going to block you in these same sectors. So that is how I think the generally kind of multilateral framing of it would be made.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, if you're talking about allies, one of the things we have to recognize is the Chinese have an extraordinary command of scale. They've lived with it for so long. And they expect to dominate, if for no other reason than at the end of the day, they will simply be larger than any single nation. And my thinking is that what we need to have the conversation, US allies, is none of us are going to be big enough to demand this reciprocity on our own. That we will simply have to have a kind of democratic civil society alliance that says we together say this is the way we need this reciprocity. And there will be some other things we'll have to do as well, but in this regard, at least making sure that we speak more as one gives us an opportunity to put the Chinese on the back foot for a while. Their rise is inevitable, but the question is, does it have to be at the expense of the civil societies and their technologies? And I don't think so if we get together, but we will have to get together.
I agree with both those comments. I think if you put this in a larger context, you look at the world independent of Trump, and I want to come back to Trump. So I'm going to abstract Trump and try to look over a 5 or 10-year time horizon. The U.S. has certain advantages over China, which we sometimes ignore. One of them is demographic. China is going to have an increasing dependency ratio of people who are not working to people who are working. The United States is the only developed country of scale which is actually not going to suffer a demographic decline. The second is, if you look at what you might call the natural balance of power in Asia, this is something that Bill Emmett pointed out some time ago. U.S. has neighbors called Canada and Mexico, who we're trying to alienate right now, but who are not threats to us and will not become threats. China has a number of countries with whom it has boundary conflicts, and there are at least 3 major powers, India and Japan, and I don't know whether you want to call Vietnam a major power, but they're not nothing, who don't want to be ruled by China, and who therefore welcome an American presence. So, you don't see Canada and Mexico, for all their desire for Chinese investment, doing the things that you would, if you wanted to reverse the 2 positions, they wouldn't reverse. The third thing is actually the dollar. Everybody talks about, China has passed the U.S. in trade. There are more, in Asia, there are more countries that trade with China than the U.S. But if you look at the role of the dollar, this famous putting the renminbi into the reserve currency basket of the IMF, everybody said, oh, this is the end of the dollar as the reserve currency. In fact, the amount of trade cleared in renminbi went up about 1%, if that. And one of the reasons for that is to have a reserve currency, you have to have deep capital markets, but you also have to have a rule of law so that the government isn't constantly stepping in to fiddle the accounts. So if you're an outsider, you're not going to put money into a currency which can be screwed up by political intervention of a communist party. So the prospect that the dollar will remain a critical power asset and point of leverage will probably be true until China gets a rule of law, which I think is a while, if ever. But the point is that we have to put this, what we just talked about, we have to put this in this larger context that we have certain assets, and the view that China has suddenly passed us and we should have we're bargaining from weakness. That's not right. But what we have done over the past decade is not insisted on reciprocity when we should have. China gets away with murder in the World Trade Organization, gets away with murder in coerced technology transfer and intellectual property transfer. Adam's written a very good work about this. And in that sense, we have not been very good at pushing reciprocity to the extent we should. So we should be pushing reciprocity more, and that's where what's more, we have the bargaining position to do it. It's not as though we're weak and therefore we have to be careful and so forth. But now let me put Trump back in the equation, because all those 3 assets that I mentioned are true whether Trump or some other person were president. What Trump has done is engaged in a trade war with China And there are two schools of thought in Trump's mind and in the American government about what to focus on. One is the bilateral trade balance. This is a total phony issue. And you can solve that very simply. China buys a lot of soybeans or natural gas. So what? Then it's like pushing a balloon. It'll just pop out somewhere else. It'll lead to a cosmetic solution where Trump says, see, I've reduced the bilateral trade balance by 50 billion or 100 billion. Pick a number. It doesn't matter. Because every economist will tell you that bilateral trade balances are not the right measure. The other school of thought, in Trump's mind, but also in the administration, which is associated with the special trade representative Lighthizer and with Peter Navarro, the trade advisor. The first school of thought is associated with Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, and the Commerce Secretary. But the second school of thought says we really have to push back on China on reciprocity. And we've got to make sure that they start living up to the rules of the WTO. We've got to start pushing back when they are trying to coerce intellectual property transfer. We should change the laws about acquisition of American companies. Europeans are starting to do the same thing. And that's where we should use our leverage. Instead, we're wasting it by spreading it around, A, and B, instead of recruiting our allies who have the same complaints about reciprocity, what are we doing? We're putting tariffs against our allies. So we're destroying our alliances, which is one of our assets, when those allies would be quite prepared to join with us to put pressure on China. So should we do more about reciprocity? Absolutely. Are we doing it? No, we're doing it in what I would call a half-baked or counterproductive fashion. So I'm sorry to go on so long, but the point is that we don't have to put up with what we're putting up with, but the way this administration is going about it, we're not going to succeed.
I just want to make one final comment to follow up on that. As part of the reason that we are not thinking in the proper terms is because we've spent 20 years saying we won the Cold War. And it's all done, right? We're the last superpower, and therefore scale doesn't matter, and we're the ones that matter, and everybody knows that. And I think it's way past time for us to realize just what percentage of the global population are consolidated democratic civil societies. Any guesses? Less than 10%, and that's generous. No, I don't have India in there right now, and we can talk about that, but no. The word consolidated mattered, so. But the point being is it's time for us to look around and recognize that an alliance of the consolidated democratic civil societies is part and parcel of all the things that Joe has said and Adam has said as well.
Okay. Well, it appears that in this area of artificial intelligence, again, the military visions and the defense needs, they do drive most of the developments. But from the other hand, we do not foresee in any reasonable chances for direct military confrontation between the two states. Now, taking the broader approach that you and Professor Nye mentioned, how would the breakthroughs in narrow artificial intelligence, in more autonomous systems and so on, how would they affect the sustainability of what we take for granted here and perhaps less here, but definitely in Europe, this Western-led world order that we, as we just said, we just don't imagine any other way of life. For example, in terms of like economic development in areas like breaking through all sorts of problems, chronic problems in different societies, how would these things be able to affect this our Western world order?
Let's make it quick. One of the things to do is to look at not only Chinese investment strategy, but basically China and even Russia's cyber policy regulation in general. They're the ones that are innovating. We're stagnant. We are stuck in the views that we've had for a long time. And AI is simply part and parcel of that. Look at what the Chinese are planning on doing. One of the more recent articles was they're hoping to put, and they're massive, sprawling subway system of handprint bio detectors. Isn't that wonderful? So convenient. It's in your hand. That's lovely. Think about what can be done with that data, with AI. Think about what can be done with that data. And we sit around going, oh, that's no problem here. Look at what they're doing. It's absolutely worth your while to look at these experiments. Another little experiment you could look at is look at the Australian-Chinese problem. Australia is trying to stand up to the Chinese. Who's their biggest export market? Awkward, okay? And they know it. The Chinese know it. The Australians know it. So look at what they're having to do. And ask yourself, what is it going to be like when it's a Denmark, it's a Germany, it's a France standing up to the Chinese versus all of us together, talking to them peer to peer?
So, I would inject a note of skepticism and caution about what China will accomplish. I think Elsa was very careful to say that these are all aspirations. Yes, China has a plan, but China's had plans in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. The plans don't always come to fruition. In fact, they often don't. In 1986, there was a plan called the H63 plan that said China was going to be the most competitive in new technologies, IT, new materials. China has been trying to build this indigenous semiconductor industry for 40 years. We all tend to assume that AI is going to be different, right? Because China has all the data, as Chris pointed out. It doesn't have privacy restrictions. It has a top-down strategy. But it may turn out that AI is not as dependent on big data as we think it is, and the US model of bottom-up, small innovation will work in ways that we are not expecting. Everybody thought that Japan was going to be the innovation powerhouse in the 80s, and the US model turned out to be much more resilient than we expected. So we have thought a lot, or beginning to think about the disruptions that AI will cause in the United States, but we haven't thought very much about what AI is going to do in China, right? AI is also going to reduce employment in China and cause other issues. The Chinese have shown some unwillingness to share their data with everyone, right? There was the case of Alibaba that was sharing data without telling users, and users in fact protested, and Alibaba had to backtrack. So we shouldn't assume that Chinese users are just going to go ahead going the whole way. So I think we've just a little skepticism that the Chinese are going to be able to accomplish everything that they lay out. They are good at strategy, but implementation always does not match what they say they're going to do, right? There's politics in China like there's politics everywhere. And I don't think we really have a very good sense of what disruptions that's going to cause within China, much less what it's going to cause in the US.
I agree with that. I think the great danger is either overestimating or underestimating China. I mean, China is going to become a very significant power and get much closer in power to the U.S. But it's not like the situation of Germany and Britain that brought on World War I. One of my colleagues says that, rising China is going to create fear in the U.S. and create a great war. And he says 14 out of 16 such situations has produced war. It's simply not true. There aren't 16 cases. There are many more than that. So the data is flawed. But even more important, the thing to remember is that World War I, Germany had already passed Britain in industrial strength 14 years before the war. China has not passed the U.S. Would I like to have China give technical assistance to the American Amtrak? Absolutely. I mean, there are a lot of things they do better, but overall they don't. If you take Shanghai Jiaotong University's ranking which is a Chinese ranking system of world universities, 15 of the top 20 universities are in the US. None are in China. The highest is Tsinghua at number 42. So yeah, they do some things very well, but they got a long way to go. And the idea that somehow they're just about to pass us, that spoils our balanced perspective of what we need, when to push hard, when to hit them, when to accommodate, and so forth. So I would urge us to keep a balanced sense on this. As for the AI point in particular, I was at a seminar at Stanford at Hoover where I spent this past winter, and there were some people who were saying, oh, given all that data and size and no privacy compartments, China will definitely win Xi Jinping's 2030 race because there's just more for the machines to learn. But that ignores several things. One is AI isn't one thing. Data isn't all the same. Some is of better quality than others. Third, I guess its point that I was making is it matters a huge amount what the algorithms are and how they're developed. And fourth, it matters a lot what the chips are, the ASICs, and how they're developed. And in those things, it's not clear that China's going to win. One of the problems of a centralized system is that everybody chases what is the direction that the party says or that the center says. The Western system is helter-skelter. We've got all kinds of people wasting money on dry holes. But you know what? Every once in a while, one of them turns out to produce shale oil, and which changed completely the equation of U.S. dependence on Middle East energy. And we are now almost independent of Middle East energy, and China is increasingly dependent on Middle East energy. So it's not clear that China's going to win the AI race. There are lots of factors in it, but I think of this seminar that I mentioned in California this past winter, I would say the preponderance of view was that at worst it's an open race, and it may well be that we come out ahead.
I received some information that we're way behind time, so I'll just collect two questions from the audience and let people to figure out. Yeah, in the back. Yeah.
So I just want to two things. I want to point out, Chris, you might have
Question.
the airport that in Israel too we have the palms, right, the biometric one. So I'm not sure if it was a democracy or not, but but my question is other. Jim told us earlier that he doesn't see a danger to America's critical infrastructure. Hence, your research with the Naval shows something different, that actually a foreign country or a superpower actually has the ability to do something with our critical infrastructure, the communication grid for that one. So how does that relate, or is it not a critical infrastructure? I mean, what is the American response to all that, and of course to this research? Is it a threat? Is it just a technical anecdote?
Well, I don't agree with Jim on that particular point, I guess we'd have to say. But I think he's right in one regard, which was because everyone is talking about it and thinking about it, then there are preparations made for how one would communicate to, say, Russia, if something were to happen. And, you don't have to have forensic attribution. You can simply decide one day that that's who did it. And so you already engage, and Chris Painter could talk about, you already engage in the kind of conversations. We'll say, here's the back channel we're going to give you, but trust me, if you do this, this is what we're going to do. It doesn't mean that they won't do it in a crisis. And it certainly doesn't mean that they aren't already penetrating and looking for ways to have that access, because you would want to if you could do. So it's that dicey place where they could do it, but you're hoping they're rational.
Okay, then one last question. Yes, please.
So for years, this is more than 10 years, we've been talking about reciprocity and the fact that the Chinese don't let us into China without giving up technology, et cetera, et cetera. 10 years ago, when China was much weaker, and the coalition of the Western countries was much stronger. We didn't do anything about it. What's different today? There's a saying in Hebrew, how is this night different than all other nights, right? What's different? Well, you're coming, and this is a much weaker situation that we're in now than 10 years ago. Why do you think it's going to work now?
People only take risks out of fear, not out of benefit. And 10 years ago, they thought they were going to make massive monies in the Chinese market. I mean, we talked about that. You know, a company would go in and their eyes would be like, oh, I'm going to make money like crazy. And then the Chinese will say, give me this. And they go, okay, that's all right here because I'm going to make money like crazy. There's much more awareness now that you can make money maybe like crazy for 3 or 4 years, but in 5 years you'll have a Chinese counterpart who seems to have mostly everything you have, and you'll start to lose. So I think they answered in 2 ways. There was much more optimism about how this could happen, this go on, and today there's much more concern, and it's much more likely to people say, you know, this sounds like a good, fair deal, than they were even willing to talk about.
Yeah, I think Chris is exactly right. 10 years ago, the assumption was the U.S. companies said, we know we're going to lose this technology, but we're always going to run faster than the Chinese. We just know we're going to innovate faster, and we're willing to lose this next generation of technology. And they structured their R&D in China, willing to lose a certain part. I think that assumption has been fundamentally shaken, and that the pressure on U.S. companies has grown intensely. I think the difference between what we're seeing now and what we saw 10 years ago is different. So I think that has changed. You're right, we're in a weaker position to try to now address that problem, but you have had a significant change in how the U.S. business and foreign business thinks about access to the market. Finally, I'll just defend Jim and say that's not what Jim meant. I don't think that's what he meant. I think Jim believes that the Chinese could attack U.S. infrastructure. They're just not likely to do it because they have lots of other things they can do, and they're certainly not going to attack U.S. infrastructure out of the blue, right? If we're talking about a Taiwan Straits crisis where, you know, there's something else has gone wrong, then maybe it will happen, but we're not.
There's also a RAND study a couple of years ago that said if you have, I mean, in one sense, you don't bring down the grid in a major way, even if you could, because you don't drop a nuclear weapon, even if you could. I mean, that's deterrence at that level. I think what Jim was saying is that's not the level to focus on. The battle is going on that's below that, at a lower level. But there was a RAND study that looked a year or so ago at a non-nuclear war in East Asia. And it was clear from that study that the U.S. would win, and win in a major way. It would be very expensive for us and for China. It would cost us about 5% of GDP, cost China about 25% of GDP. That may be another reason they don't. But on your point about the companies have obviously learned that the technique they were using of a rolling transfer of intellectual property they were running out of steam on that and profits on it. But the government position has changed as well. Back in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was the view that was articulated by Bob Zoellick when he was Deputy Secretary of State, which he said, our aim is to make China a responsible stakeholder in the international system. And there was a general view that as China got richer, it wouldn't become a democracy, but it would tend to open up and liberalize. It would become more market-oriented and somewhat more politically open. And what we've seen is just the opposite. Xi Jinping has increased the role of state-owned enterprises, A, and B, he's closed things down, and he's used the emperor model, and he's rejected Deng Xiaoping's policy of putting an orderly transition into the Communist Party system. I personally, and many people I know who know China much better than I do, think that was a huge mistake. In other words, it's made the system much more fragile. Even though it's enhanced Xi's power in the short run, it means the system as a whole is considerably more fragile by reversing Deng Xiaoping's approach. So in addition to the business changes that my colleagues described, the government has now realized that its aspirations for a more open China have changed, and that's led to a pretty broad consensus on one half of of the trade policy I mentioned earlier. That half is the reciprocity on coerced intellectual property transfer. That's shared by Democrats and Republicans, and that would be true independent of Trump. What's the problem with the current administration is Trump has gotten confused about whether bilateral trade deficits ought to be an objective, and wound up in a war with our own allies, which is reducing our leverage over the Chinese on the intellectual property. If we used our alliances and worked on the Chinese on that, we might succeed. So in that sense, we're shooting ourselves in the foot.
Okay, thank you very much. I surely enjoyed it. Please join me.